Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Tom Hardy is possessed by something alien in the Marvel Comics adaptation Venom.
Investigative reporter Eddie Brock, played by Tom Hardy, destroyed his career and his relationship with Anna Wang, played by Michelle Williams, when he accused Carlton Drake, owner of the Life Foundation, played by Riz Ahmed, of using and killing homeless people in secret experiments. 6 months later, Dr. Dora Skirth, played by Jenny Slate, blows the whistle to Eddie, and when he investigates, he becomes host to an alien symbiote that calls itself Venom. The alien grants Eddie superpowers but also a ravenous appetite, and Eddie must control whether it becomes hero or villain.
Sony has a Spider-Man problem. It's their biggest franchise and moneymaker. They got the rights before Marvel was making films of their own, and it's proved extremely lucrative for them. They made the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, the first two of which are still considered to be some of the best comic book movies ever made. The problem is that Sam Raimi isn't making Spider-Man movies anymore, and therein lies the rub, because if Sony wants to hold on to those rights, they have to keep on making Spider-Man movies. Otherwise, they revert back to Marvel, and they're not going to relinquish those anytime soon. That was the logic behind the Amazing Garfield movies, which tried to set their own universe entirely out of the Spider-Man IP, that went down pretty much like a lead balloon, especially after the second one effectively torpedoed that idea. So after that debacle, Sony said to Marvel, okay, you can have Spider-Man, but we still control the character, we still have the actual rights to it, and the solo movies that you make with him will be made by us. But Sony, they still want to use that Spider-Man IP for themselves. What they really should have done was they should have made an animated movie with the character. That would have been good. And we're getting one, actually. Just this December, we're getting Into the Spider-Verse, which looks very, very promising indeed. However, what if you could make a Spider-Man movie without Spider-Man? Clearly that was the thinking by Sony behind Venom, as that's far easier than having to reboot the character every time he has a new incarnation. And it's almost ingenious, really, when you think about it, because if this movie's successful, they can have more sequels and build a universe of symbiotes around this character, and they can make Spider-Man movies without having to use Spider-Man, but at the same time, still leaving the door open, just in case Tom Holland wants to have a cameo and sort of link it into the larger universe. I mean, that's really smart when you think about it. And Venom is by far one of the most popular characters in the Spider-Man universe. He could work potentially as a standalone entity. He's already been on the big screen before in Spider-Man 3, played by Topher Grace, and it's pretty clear in that film that it was treated as an afterthought because Raimi wasn't a fan of the character. It was foisted upon him by the studio. So you could very easily improve on that portrayal in that movie, and with Tom Hardy in the lead role, that almost certainly shows a lot of promise. So can Venom work as a standalone film? No. But you know what? The results are so disastrous that they're frankly fascinating. I was entertained by this movie. I make no bones about that, but probably not in the way the filmmakers intended. This film backfires so spectacularly and is another example of Sony getting things so wrong with this property that it's so bad it's good. Unfortunately, it takes a while before it gets to that point. The first act of Venom is leaden. It's not fun bad, it's just bad, and a big reason for that is unnecessary amounts of prologue. The movie opens with a pre-title sequence of the symbiotes arriving. That's fine, but then in the next 20 minutes, it spends much of that trying to set up Eddie Brock. We spend a lot of time following him around the streets of San Francisco, and he's investigating the homeless people and what they have to do with the Life Organization, and clearly there's a conspiracy, there's a cover-up, and he just has to sniff it out. The big problem here is we don't care about any of it. This isn't the movie that we came to see, and it's really tedious to watch in the early stages. And also, it's really pointless in the grand scheme of things, because on a plot level, it doesn't pay off in a larger way, and on a character level, it's forgotten the second that he gets infected for the most part. So why bother spending so much time establishing this? Also, he's not remotely credible as a journalist, the thing that completely explodes his career is very well deserved, because frankly, no journalist or reporter would ever do the move that Eddie does in this film, where he breaks into his girlfriend's emails, reads a confidential legal document, and then uses in an interview that he wouldn't be able to do because he can't substantiate the source, it's a private document, and also he would be sued to kingdom come. And like that person is ever going to answer something that's in a court case in an interview on camera. It's just ridiculous, quite frankly. So right from the outset, it's not even remotely plausible. What really puts the cherry on top here is that this is entirely unnecessary. The movie then shortly thereafter does a time jump of 6 months. If you started the movie from that point and just sort of filled in the sort of blanks there, you'd be fine. You'd pick up the story and you wouldn't have missed anything, because again, it does not pay off in the grand scheme of things. In fact, opening the movie with a 6-month time gap actually introduces even more problems in the film, especially with regards to the timeline. There's a subplot with the rival symbiotes Riot. That lands in Malaysia and it passes from person to person to person, and it takes it about 6 months to figure out how to board an aircraft? Huh? Really? Also, you must be wondering, why is the symbiote going to America? Why is it doing that? What's its purpose? And the answer is, because the plot says so. Because this isn't very well written at all. It's 35-40 minutes, I think, before Venom actually shows up properly in this movie, which is a huge mistake right from the outset, because that's the thing that people want to see, but instead, the movie pads itself and keeps doing so because it knows that its story is wafer thin, even by the standards of this thing. And also, it's a really good way of making sure the running time is exactly the right length without having to have too many special effects in it. I hate to be cynical, but that's clearly what they're doing here. And if you just chucked out the first 20 pages of this script, maybe you would have had a bit more time for the Venom stuff later on. Maybe. But once Eddie and the symbiote finally combine together, that's when things really take a turn. They say about movie trailers is that they represent the films the studios wanted to make, if not necessarily the films themselves. You will find no clearer example of this than Venom. If you've seen the trailers for this movie, you've probably thought of it as this kind of horror-inspired superhero film, or maybe anti-hero, and it's kind of freaky and scary and playing up the body horror angle of it. That is not this movie, although I think it's trying to be. You could definitely say that this movie was trying to be like that to a certain extent, but if that's the case, it misses that target by about 100 miles, because it goes from 0 to goofy almost instantaneously. The second that Eddie has it in his body, it is played really comically. And I know that some of this is intentional. The director of the movie is Ruben Fleischer, who is best known for Zombieland, and then subsequently disappointing us every outing since. But in this movie, if he's trying to balance the horror and comedy elements, he's skewed way too in favour of the comedy. And in fact, Tom Hardy actually probably goes way too far with it as well. Try to imagine someone as intense as Tom Hardy, someone that throws himself bodily into every role they play. In this case, he does that quite literally. There'll be scenes where he's wandering down the street and he hears the voice in his head going, "Hungry," and he goes, "Ah, ah, ah." And that's the kind of performance that he gives in this movie. He gives a performance that's constantly freaking out over his own body, over his own mind. He is flailing his body around wildly. It's very much reminiscent of something that Carrey would do, or even Nick Cage at his most extravagant. And you just watch it on screen, and the second this starts up, you stop being able to take him seriously, because it is really, really goofy to watch this play out on screen. I'd imagine it was probably even more so without the effects being there. I would love to see a cut of this movie without the effects being there and just having Tom Hardy just sort of do all these sort of weird bodily movements. I would pay to see that. Even in the early stages of the symbiosis, they don't play up the horror elements, they don't play up the sort of abnormality of it or the kind of unsettling nature of having something inside your body. It's all played almost like it's kind of sitcom level. I mean, there are scenes in this film that are flat out of a comedy. A key example of this is a scene where Eddie has recently been infected and he's looking for food while also trying to talk to Michelle Williams, and while doing so he's picking up food off other people's plates and he's ramming it into his mouth, and eventually he climbs into the lobster tank and bites one of their heads off. And I go, what is the objective of this scene? I mean, I know it's meant to be comedy, but is it meant to be this broad? Like, why is this scene here? It doesn't fit at all, and the tone all the way through this movie is like a seesaw. It just oscillates from one end to the other, just like back and forth, and pretty much every time that Tom Hardy was on screen, I was giggling with laughter, and I wasn't the only one. I'm just going to flat out say this. This movie's a mess from start to finish in every conceivable department, but you know what was captivating about it? Tom Hardy. I enjoyed every moment of his probably wildly misguided performance. I never knew where it would go next. He would walk into scenes and he would do something incredibly strange and just throw me off guard. There's a scene where he's talking about having the symbiote inside him and he describes it as up the ass. Like, that's the actual words he used. And he says it with such a weird inflection. That becomes like a running thing through that scene. This is a performance that is ready-made for YouTube supercuts and to be turned into memes. I'm not joking. Like, every single scene seems to have just this kind of unusual choice made in it. And the movie as a whole is like that. As the second half of it plays out, such bizarre, bewildering things happen that I was frankly agape all the way through the second half of this movie. I was wondering, like, what crazy thing is going to happen next? Who at Sony allowed this much weirdness, quite frankly, to come out of $100 million tentpole? Whoever was in charge of looking over this project and watching the dailies wasn't paying enough attention. There are things that happen in this movie that I still can't believe happened, and I watched it. There's a moment that has sexy Venom in it. Sexy Venom! The script for this movie is dreadful. It is so simple and straightforward that it is utterly predictable in terms of plot progression. You can name exactly where it's going to go, beat for beat for beat, and I knew what was going to happen with certain characters way ahead of time, but the movie rushes forward whether or not it makes sense or not, and it doesn't a lot of the time. In fact, this movie has a lot of contradictions, seemingly, a lot of kind of weird logic holes all the way throughout it. Like, they establish the fact that the symbiotes need to have very particular hosts because otherwise they reject them and they kill them. And yet, in the second half of the movie, the symbiotes are bouncing around from body to body, and that apparently isn't an issue anymore. It doesn't kill the host like it did previously. And I know that a lot of people have compared this film to the sort of era of superhero movies from the early noughties, things like Hulk or Catwoman, and maybe there is some comparison there, but what I was really thinking of was an even earlier era of superhero films. I was thinking of superhero films from the 90s, quite frankly, a lot of the time, because what this movie reminded me of was this kind of weird mashup of The Mask and Spawn. And it really seems like a very uneven mixture of those two. It even has a closing credit rap number about the movie sung by Eminem, which is shocking all by itself. That's a terrible song over the end credits. This movie feels like it's come from a completely different era. It feels like it comes from a time when superhero movies were made by people that didn't know what the properties were, didn't really care about them, they just wanted the money and the name recognition. And so having that kind of movie arrive in 2018, no wonder Venom feels like an anomaly, because it is. We've progressed so far past that point. We have comic book movies made by people that genuinely love the things that they're based on, and it shows in their work. Here, it feels like a bunch of extremely confused people that had no idea what they were doing, but it's almost glorious to watch it. The dialogue in this film is wretched. How bad is the dialogue? You can actually see the actors on screen almost wincing at it. The characters are not even one-dimensional a lot of the time. Michelle Williams looks like she's actually in pain at certain points in this film, trying to recite the words that are coming out of her mouth. She is given this utterly thankless role all throughout the movie. She gets one moment of agency and otherwise is largely superfluous to the plot, and she could easily be written out of the movie. She's that expendable. Riz Ahmed, who I think is a really talented actor, is also saddled with this very underwritten villain part who is written like a cartoon character. His motivations don't really make a lot of sense, and he basically goes into scenes just cackling away his motivations, just straightforwardly saying, oh, I think humans are not worthy of survival. I think that they just deserve to die and just are expendable. Like, he just straight up says that in scenes, doesn't even try to hide it. Like, yes, we know the character's evil, and you can see Riz Ahmed trying desperately to make him into something recognizable as a legitimate human being, and the movie just steamrollers over him. In fact, the most character development that Riz Ahmed has in this movie is in the wardrobe department, because he wears this zip-up fleece in the movie, and it's zipped up all the way to the neck, and over the course of the film, it gently goes down all the way through it to show that he's kind of unravelling a bit, it's really subtle there. It says something when Riz Ahmed's zip has a greater character arc than himself. I will admit, there are some cool Venom moments here and there, but it's also clear that the filmmakers didn't really know how to visualise the character on screen. A lot of the time he looks like a chewed up piece of gum or sentient tar pit, and I know that the filmmakers were trying to do some creative things with him in the action scenes, but it's not especially well photographed or even particularly clear what's going on. A lot of the time it looks like blobs just going hither and dither in various directions, giving the impression of something happening, and that describes a lot of the action scenes very well. It's clear they're trying to keep in the PG-13 rating. You get the impression of someone having their head ripped off. That's about it. You get the sense they could have pushed this far further if they had the R rating, and it's disappointing that they didn't. But a lot of the time the action scenes are really kind of clumsily staged and often unintentionally hilarious. This is especially the case with the climax of the movie, which just turns into an utter CGI fest. We just have monsters duking it out with each other, and nothing on screen is real a lot of the time. The actors fall off screen and are replaced by their digital counterparts. It just feels weightless. There's no stakes to any of it. We're just watching computer graphics fight each other, especially because, again, it's so incredibly unclear what's happening at certain points. They try and be clever with it by having the characters sort of merge together, but that just ends up looking really, really puzzling on screen and really makes you uncertain of, wait, why is this happening? What's happened? And even after the climax had occurred, I wasn't quite sure how certain things had occurred afterwards, and that's not something you really should be leaving your audience with coming out of the cinema. Venom is bad, but it's bad for all the right reasons. There is a scene in this movie that sums up my experience. Tom Hardy is digging through the trash and he finds some half-eaten chicken legs and starts devouring into them. That was me. This is my kind of trash. This is the kind of glorious misfire that only comes along every so often. It's the kind of movie that comic book fans are going to be poring over for years to come, analysing every strange decision and asking, why did they do that? It's almost ready for midnight screenings of people chanting lines like a turd in the wind right back to the screen. That, incidentally, is the last scene in the movie before the credits. No joke. Speaking of credits, the hugely overlong credits, I think this movie might even be 90 minutes long without them. Definitely stick around. There's a post-credit scene that adds to the hilarity as it has one of the worst wigs I have ever seen in a movie that looks like someone scout Ronald McDonald. But then, towards the end of the credits, there is a very long snippet of a much better thing than the entirety of this movie. But honestly, if you get the chance and you can see it at a fairly low rate, absolutely see Venom. You've got to see this to believe it. I genuinely think that you'll have a blast at just how WTF this movie is. As a franchise starter, though, try again, Sony.
I was entertained by Venom for what I suspect are all the wrong reasons, because this is a fascinating train wreck. After a tedious first act, once Hardy is infected with the titular creature, the movie itself mutates into an absolute laugh riot. It almost becomes like a surreal buddy movie as the usually intense actor flails and mugs with such ferocity that it's almost impossible to take him seriously, bypassing horror straight into goofiness. The script is both illogical and simplistic, featuring dialogue so awful that you can visibly see the actors wince trying to say it. Riz Ahmed and Michelle Williams look painfully embarrassed, and it's tragic to see such talented performers in such a breathtaking mess. Playing like The Mask meets Spawn, there are moments here that are so bewildering that they left me speechless, and the movie as a whole is so gloriously awful that it actually borders on so bad it's good, and this will be dissected by comic book fans for years.
If you like this review, then you can assimilate with my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.